Hello and welcome. I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to make a piece for the Handcraft 2026 exhibition. The guild that I'm in for weaving and spinning is participating in the Handcraft 2026 put on by the American Craft Council, which is celebrating 250 years of American crafts. I will put a link to further information below on the wider Handcraft 2026, where you can find exhibitions near you. The one that I'm participating in is going to be shown at the end of summer. And I will put the information that I do have below. Just know that I won't have open hours or anything like that just yet. As part of the show, I was initially going to weave a historic cloth with commercial yarn and make a bag. However, I was having some trouble making up the draft in order to reproduce the historic pattern. So instead, I am taking fabric that I wove with my hand spun, and we're going to make a small bag out of it for the display. And along the way, we'll talk about some of the things to note while working with hand-woven fabric. Let's get started. Like all patterns, the first step is to cut my fabric. I find that the roller cutter is much easier with hand-woven fabrics if you're cutting straight lines. It just tends to fray a little less and have the edge threads come out less often as I do this. I do always cut extra seam allowance though in all of my hand-woven garments, because I need to have that space to secure the ends and potentially deal with any loose threads as I go. This being a rectangle, it was fairly easy. I kind of just cut the one edge to make it straight, and then kind of got an idea for how long I wanted the purse and the flap to be, and then cut an extra inch or so to give me room for seam allowances for the bottom and for the top to make sure those ends are secured and nicely tucked away. Before I do any sewing whatsoever, I use a zigzag stitch on the very ends of my fabric where I have cut so that I can secure those ends and prevent any fraying as I'm working with it. This is really important if you have to manipulate the fabric a lot. In this case, it was probably less important, but I generally, for a hard-wearing item like a bag, still zigzag the ends, even though I'm also going to be securing it with a lining. That way, the threads don't fall out over time, weakening the seam. Once my ends were secure on my hand-woven fabric, I pieced together my lining from 3 fat quarter squares that I had gotten that coordinate but do not match. And I just lined them up and did a 1/4 inch seam allowance to put all 3 sections together in a single row to make attaching it to the hand-woven easier, even though I will also sew in between each section to secure it to the hand-woven fabric a little better. The hand-woven fabric that I'm using does not have really straight and smooth selvages, partially because I was initially planning to make something that I cut out this fabric, or I felted the fabric and then cut it out. So I was not as careful as I should be. The other part of this is this was the very end of my warp, and I was using very stretchy materials in both my warp and my weft. So it was a little difficult to keep a nice clean selvage. So part of what I'm going to end up doing with the lining is to help cover some of those areas, and then I'm going to actually bind all of the edges of the purse to kind of hide those imperfections in the hand woven. And while most bags should be lined, it's especially important to line bags that are made out of stretchy material. And this wool fabric that I wove is very stretchy. So I am using a quilted cotton as the lining to help prevent stretch as you put items in the bag. Once the lining is together, I start from the bottom of the lining and the bottom edge of the purse, and I sew them together, right sides together, with about a 1/4 to 1/2 inch seam allowance. That way I can easily then flip this right side out and iron it so that everything lays flat. Once I ironed the initial seam that I made, I went ahead and I sewed along both of the edges. I did stop periodically to make sure that it was not stretching, and I had clipped it fairly aggressively because I am mixing a stretch fabric and a non-stretch fabric, and I didn't want any bubbling. I personally find that putting the non-stretchy fabric on top helps me keep it from stretching out of place, but that's because of me being a little heavy-handed with guiding fabric through the sewing machine. Um, Sometimes other people find that putting the stretch on the bottom is easier for them, especially since hand-woven fabric that I'm working with is a little thicker, and the feet can kind of get caught up in that. So if you have that problem, putting the kind of commercial fabric on the bottom as you put it through the machine can help counteract some of that. I know this looks a little funny because usually you keep the bulk of your fabric outside of your machine, but I have found that if I am working from bottom to top on one seam, I need to work bottom to top on the other seam if my fabric is especially stretchy. This helps keep everything square. If I were to go bottom to top on the stretchy material and then top to bottom, I would not have a very square rectangle, and that could cause problems when I go to then construct the handbag when I do my folds and final seaming. So this is just a way to make sure that my seams are sewn in the same direction on the same side of the fabric. That way I don't have a seam on the fashion fabric facing up and then the hand woven fabric facing up. So with something small like this, it's easy to put through the machine like this, and it helps prevent some of the other issues with stretching and misaligning of fabric. Once the hand woven and the lining fabrics were sewn together, I then went through and top stitched at each joining point. So at the very bottom, in between each of the panels, and at the very top. I did this so that the cotton fabric can help stabilize the wool hand woven fabric and prevent it from stretching as it is being used and kind of pulling away from that lining fabric. This just helps protect the seams a little bit by preventing some of the movement that the wool fabric will want to do. I will sometimes even do this with fabric that doesn't stretch because it helps tack the lining to the outer fabric to keep it from like bubbling or kind of just sagging inside the bag. I think it just looks cleaner and helps present a more professional finish, in my opinion. Now that the lining is secured to the outer fabric, it's time to sew up the sides of the bag. Now for my fold, it's a little more than a third folded up. I wanted to have the flap be almost down to the bottom, but not quite. So kind of visually, it's a determination of the proportions you want. Once I had everything pinned, or in this case clipped, where I wanted it to, I sewed down each side working from top to bottom, only where the two parts overlap to make the bag. I do use clips when I do hand woven because I feel like it holds better and it doesn't pick up the threads of my hand woven as easily. I tend to make some thicker fabrics for things like purses and the like, so I'm using somewhat thick threads and they can get caught or split very easily with pins, so I do tend to clip hand woven material versus pin it. I don't think anything bad would happen if you pin it. This is more of a personal preference for me, but if you do have clips, they tend to help, in my opinion, stabilize the fabric a little bit as you're putting it through the sewing machine. To help cover some of my weaving failures in this cloth, I decided to bind all of the edges, and that included the top of the flap, the top of the inside, the bottom of the bag, which just helps keep it from stretching out as you put stuff in it, and up both of the sides. And I did this binding in the same fabric that I was going to use to make the handle. I actually got a lot of free quilting cotton that was already cut up in strips to be made into blocks and binding from a quilter. And so I went through and I found a color that I liked with the hand woven fabric. And it is not bias binding because it is all cut on the straight of grain, but I made it like bias binding where I folded both ends to the center and ironed them, and then folded everything in half and ironed that so that all the raw edges were inside and I could sandwich the binding around the edges of the purse. Because this binding was not on the bias and because I was using a stretchy outer fabric, I did each strip independently so that the corners were kind of cut in together versus kind of trying to finagle it around to make a curved edge. This did cause a lot of bulk where the bottom binding, all four layers of the bag, and the new binding went in together. And so I did have to hand sew those very bottom corners to secure it there because it was just too much to go through my machine. But once I got those corners done, the rest of it sewed on fairly easily. And as you can see here, I am still sewing in the same direction on each side of the fabric. That way I still don't have any places where I'm pulling it off of grain. To make the strap, I just took the binding that I had made and sewed up the one side to seal off the strap so that the binding could not come open. Once I did that, I just kind of measured where I wanted it to be on the bag, and I did each side separately instead of pinning it on all at once, because I just find that easier so that I'm not pulling the pinned side out of whack as I'm sewing the first side. Again, this was really bulky, so what I did is I did the initial contact seam right above where the two parts of the bag kind of end and it becomes the flap, so that I had less to sew through on my machine. And then I ladder stitched all the way around the tab that was created to make sure that it stayed flat and that the raw edges of the handle stayed secure against the bag and didn't kind of fray just with friction and trying to work its way out. This is actually a really easy project to do, and it is one that does not require a lot of the hand-woven fabric, because especially if it is a fabric like this thick wool, you're going to want a nice thin like quilting cotton lining to add stability and to reduce bulk. So it's super easy to try this one as a first go for sewing with your hand woven. It also doesn't need to be exact, so if you have to make bigger seam allowances than you accounted for, it's okay. You can also enclose your really wonky edges in a binding so no one has to know how not neat your selvages were, especially if you are new to weaving or new to weaving with a certain material type. And now that the bag's done, I will see you in the reveal. I hope you found that informative, and I hope to see you at one of the handicraft exhibits. And while you're down there looking at the information for a location near you, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.